Uh, I'll give a little, for those that don't know who I am, here's a little background. I've been a Drupal developer since 2008-ish. I go by the date that I signed up for an account on Drupal.org. That's pretty much the easiest way to keep up with it. And since then, I've seen tons of design patterns come and go, and things that are kind of trendy for a couple of years and then they go away. So I've had a lot of time to, I guess, reflect on what worked for me and what didn't. And right now, currently, I have a lot of focus on using atomic design principles and Pattern Lab with Drupal 9. Now, Pattern Lab early on in Drupal 8 was fairly significant. You don't find a lot of it in Drupal 9 now. There's not like a whole lot of like out of the box themes that include Pattern Lab with like a grunt file or task runner of some sort. And so this is sort of my attempt at trying to do that for today's presentation, but I'll also show a real world example where we've done this at my current job, which is at Robert Half. I'm working on the Protivity and Vision products for roberthalf.com, and we have taken a Pattern Lab atomic design approach, and we'll get into some of the reasons of why in just a few moments. But that's me in a nutshell. I've been doing Drupal since like Drupal 6.2 or something like that, and I continue to learn and grow every day as a member of Esteemed, which I'm very proud of. Got the shirt. So let's get started. So Pattern Lab and Drupal 9, the what, when, where, why, and how. So I've got a couple of references here. I'm not going to bore you by reading off of my own screen. I will provide links to the, there will be a reference section at the end of the presentation, and I will provide all of this in a GitLab repo for anyone that's interested. But just to kind of touch base on where we're coming from, atomic design basically boils down to this. If you think about certain components on a website that are reused several times, or maybe even like larger structures that are reused over and over again on certain pages, it doesn't make sense to continue to write code for that over and over and over again, and nor should you as a front-end designer or a back-end developer when you're trying to integrate. And so what I've tried to do here is take this atomic design approach and actually apply that more directly to Drupal 9 specifically, using a combination of Pattern Lab and a very cool module that I found called the components module, which allows you to extend your front-end development with Twig or even some other libraries like React and things of those nature. So you can use, specifically, you can use external Twig templates that you may find handy and want to reuse, and use them directly in Drupal, which in turn makes Drupal design for people that may not have started or cut their teeth with Drupal able to write Twig more flexibly and still be able to use it. We'll get into that a little bit better, but first, let's just talk about what atomic design is. Now, like I said, I'm not going to read everything off of these two links, but these two links are the bread and butter of what we're going to go over today. Atomic design methodology was written by Brad Frost, and he's done tons of research into this. I hope hope that you guys take some time to read through this. I know I have, and most of the members of my team at Protivity have read or referenced some of these materials at one time or another throughout the life of our project. Basically boils down to this. We're taking cues. They take cues from chemistry. So imagine a molecule, and then imagine dissecting that down to its smallest elements. And that's what atomic design is all about. So they go on to reference the periodic table of elements and so on and so forth. But what we want to focus on is this slide right here. So atoms are going to be your smallest design elements. This could be anything as simple as like how to stop your H1s, your H2s, paragraphs, your fonts, your colors, that sort of stuff. Not necessarily twig, but sometimes you may have a combination of a little bit of some markup, but your focus here is going to be basically on like variable type stuff, colors and fonts and that sort of stuff. Then you've got molecules, and that's where you start putting these atoms together to create more complex, let's say, microbial life. We're not quite to organisms yet, but maybe like you're creating like the carbon chains of DNA to create more complex structure over time. For Drupal, generally in the projects that we've worked on, unless we're working with a designer that wants to see complete pages inside of the Pattern Lab, generally we don't go past the organism stage. And this is just my own personal, I guess, experience. Organisms basically end up being a finished paragraph or a block or some sort of a custom entity that we're going to use in like Layout Builder or maybe in the Display Manager or something of those of that nature. So we could always create twig templates that are, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 organisms combined. Like when I say an organism, maybe it's like a section and then there's another paragraph underneath and then a form, and it's not quite a page, but it's something that you might have like a footer. A footer would be a really high level organism, or maybe even a low level template that you would use throughout your website, multiple uses. And then pages are obviously pages. And we're familiar with these two as Drupal developers. We do work with actual templates and actual page TPL files. But as far as Pattern Labs goes, we generally do the first 3 steps here in the Pattern Lab. And then as far as atomic design goes, the templates and pages benefit as a result of what we've done in Pattern Lab. And I can show that and explain a little further. But this is the most important, probably visual to remember when you're trying to kind of decide what goes where in an atomic design. And I'll, don't want to just sit here and go through everything, but an atom might be like a search, the site, or a label, whereas a molecule is going to be something like the whole search box itself. It's got an atom that has a label here at the top, and another input atom and a search button atom, and those 3 things combined would make a search box molecule. And you may use that in combination with some other molecule to create like maybe a navigation menu or some sort of interaction in a block or something like that. And then organisms, of course, this is about where we're going to end. So You've got a logo, you've got links. All of these are comprised of the smaller elements. The atoms make up the molecules. The molecules are added together to make up the organism. Go ahead and take note of that, read that. It's not something that you can just breeze through in an hour. I could go on for days looking at this stuff. And then tools of the trade. One of the most effective tools, and we're primarily focusing on today, is going to be a Pattern Lab. Basically, you want to take away these bullet points here. The Pattern Lab is it's a static generator tool to build atomic design systems. It is agnostic of frameworks, so it only does what you put in it. So if you wanted to create a Pattern Lab that's based on Bootstrap, you can do that. If you wanted to create a completely vanilla HTML 1.0 blue and purple links with no styling in a Pattern Lab, and then start creating your CSS gradually and using your own systems or your own design methods as far as CSS or SAS or whatever the case may be, you can do that. And it very much says that here. It's a UI. It is not a UI framework like Bootstrap or Foundation or Bulma or any of those, and is not a replacement for a content management system. It's literally just a static page with all of the little pieces of a website that you're going to use and reuse over and over and over again in your design. It also provides a really good reference when you are comparing notes with your visual designer. If you're on a team like we are, we have several front-end developers. We have one main designer and a couple of people that she answers to as well that aren't even in my team. And when you're working with collaboration on this, it's important that you have sort of a base camp or a common ground that everyone can look at and go, okay, digitally on the web, that's what it's going to look like, and we approve or we disapprove, and here are our notes. Pattern Lab serves for us as that middle ground between your XD and UX and UI, like they're using tools like XD or Illustrator, and it bridges the gap between the developer and those people. And trust me, I have played every single role in that scenario. And while Pattern Lab is a little cumbersome at first, it helps to alleviate some of the loss in translation of design language, maybe jargon and terminology that doesn't jive between the 2 or 3 different factions that are working on the same part of the website. Is very useful for that. So please take a look at Brad Frost's Atomic Design. I'll provide links when we get done, and that should give you a better idea of where we're at. Boy, that scroll went really fast. Okay, so when do you want to use Pattern Lab? Well, I touched on that just a little bit. Pattern Lab is very effective when you have a broad team that's working around the clock. Pretty much, I mean, it doesn't have to be around the clock, but in my case, we have we're about half and half US domestic developers and then overseas developers in India, with about anywhere from a 10 to 12 hour time difference. And so using the Pattern Lab was a great tool for us to unite our message as one development team, even with the time dilation. It allows us to visually compose what needs to be done on the website, and then we're able to pass off from front-end developer to back-end developer relatively with ease. I also have a link here about what Pattern Lab is and why you should care about it. This was written by Prevail. It's a little old, but they're still very current. And I suggest maybe reading over it. And there's that graphic again. So it's very important. They reference Brad Frost. And they go on and talk about like, why would you want to end your project? Basically what I've been saying here is that it aids in keeping developers, designers, and stakeholders on track when it comes to visual decisions. It's one of the most important things for a design is to keep it on track and try to prevent scope creep. And this helps with that. It also helps with sending decisions that you've made up the chain with some of the stakeholders, or maybe some of the bosses that aren't involved in the day-to-day, but they want to see a conceptual idea of where you're at and what you're working on. So you can go into this and read it. I find it very valuable to learn more about it if you're interested in using Pattern Lab for a project. As a, let's say, a single autonomous, like on your own, you're a lone wolf, kind of a Flynn's arcade kind of guy where you're writing Tron the game by yourself, whatever. Pattern Lab doesn't really help that much if you're on a extremely small team or an extremely small budget. If you have the ability to do the design, interpret the design, and then apply the design into a template. Now, you may want to make it part of your workflow, and that's cool. But in my own experience, for smaller projects or things that I'm working solo on, I've never really had a need to use Pattern Labs for pet projects and things like that. It might be useful if you're trying to quickly, how do you say, scaffold together like a mock-up or something like that, rather than just handing off like Illustrator files or XD files. Pattern Labs might be a handy tool to use in that case, but it just really depends on the scope and scale of the project on whether or not you would want to use it. Obviously, in the case of Productivity and Robert Half, we're using it and using it effectively to keep a fairly large development team on task. Those are my two takeaways from that. Take it for a grain of salt. If you've got another reason to use Pattern Labs, I'd love to hear it. For me, that this is just what's working right now for us. So where do we install Pattern Lab? Well, it's a good question. Not every project, let's say it's not a Drupal project, okay? Since Pattern Lab is not a framework and it is not a content management system or anything like that, you can technically install Pattern Lab pretty much on any machine that you want that has NPM, Node, Composer, and a handful, and there's like a handful of packages that come with it. So yeah, you can install it anywhere. And if that's what you need to do to show maybe some advanced design stuff that you can't like convey in XD or some other design tool like hover effects or transitions or animations and stuff, Pattern Lab is perfect for that. So you may, I say you might not want to use it as a solo designer, but in that case, if you're like really trying to impress someone and you want to show them like, yes, with a little bit of JavaScript and a little bit of HTML, blah, 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 we can do this. And you can also give them the Pattern Lab, which would give them all of the definitions of the code that you've developed, and it basically labels every single component so that they could see, okay, this is a button, these are what all the buttons look like, this is how a button behaves, this is a search box, this is what the search box looks like, this is the padding, these are the colors, yada, 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 but this is also how the search box behaves when we hover on. So those are some of the reasons that you would want to install Pattern Lab pretty much anywhere. For this case, the long answer is to install on a common repository, a staging environment, or any place where your front end team would gain from having access to it. In the case of Protiviti and the Vision project, we have decided to install Pattern Lab inside of our custom Drupal theme, and using the components module for Drupal, we can actually take the Pattern Lab components directly and include them or import them as macros into Drupal twig templates, Drupal block templates, page templates, etc., and so on. So that's even like an added layer of effectiveness in how we're using it. It's not necessary. You don't have to actually do that if you've got the resources. But for us, it makes things so much better because I can just create a menu or like a nav bar or whatever, and style it and put all the things in it, and all the libraries that are needed are there. And as soon as I'm done, I commit, I write comments on my tickets, and I can send it to Manish, my coworker in India, and he's the backend developer. And then he can tie that in and use Drupal field values, Drupal, pretty much any part of the Drupal API that can be used as a twig variable, and use those twig templates that I've written in Pattern Labs directly to render onto the screen in the Drupal website. So it's pretty sweet how that works. And it's basically been the glue that binds our entire team together for the last 3-4 months. And so it's a very effective tool. I can't go on enough about it. So for us, we installed it in the Drupal custom theme that we're developing. And why do we use Pattern Labs? Well, I think you know why. I'm not going to explain 100 times over the same thing that I've just been saying, but there are newer tools out. There's newer things that have come out, and I'm not super familiar with them, and I'm open to suggestions. For one, I think there was a theme that in Drupal 8 was using Pattern Lab, and when they switched to Drupal 9, I think it's called the Emulsify theme, they switched to another sort of prototyping / integration visual tool called Storybooks. And if any of you guys are familiar with that, I'm as green as new freshly cut grass on that. I don't know much about Storybooks, but I would love to hear your remarks. And we can do that. We can open that up in a little bit with Q&A session. So how do you install and integrate it with Drupal, and how well does it work? Well, fortunately, I have a few examples that I can show, and we can kind of go through a day-to-day workflow for me. And I'm also working on a public version of a Drupal 9 theme that has Pattern Labs ready to go with a grunt task manager. I tried to have it ready before today, ran into a few issues with some of the code. I had a couple of blockers, so we may do a part 2 to this in a few weeks or something. But for now, I can show you examples of what we've done with Protiviti and how that works. So let's dig into that for just a second. Let me spin up one of the. I'll spin up one of our projects really quick and show you basically what I'm working with here, and I'll show examples of what those things actually look like in XD and how we implemented them in Pattern Lab, and then how they became part of our development environment. Give me just a second, we'll go into that. Hopefully you can see the mock-ups here on my screen. I'm sure they're very tiny. I'll go ahead and zoom in here. You can start to see our homepage, which I just recently finished and passed off this header up here from this design through Pattern Labs, and then passed off to our backend developers, who then finished it and have passed it off to QA. And unfortunately, I didn't get everything right the first time, so it came right back. We can do some fixes on it. You guys are going to see how that works. So this is the original XD file. Go ahead and spin this one up really quick. While that waits to load, I'll see if I can pull up our actual project. Yeah, there we go. So this bar out of the way. Just a second for this to start up. You can already see how this has come together. So here's our home page as the designer intended it. This is actually a work in progress version of XD. That's not the most up-to-date version, but you get the idea. We've got our hero title, we've got our cover story here, we've got a hamburger menu, our CTA, our search box, and that sort of stuff. And what we did there ultimately here, search, click through to the CTA, which I think, yeah, want to another work in progress. The hamburger menu opens, that sort of stuff. This is kind of our production server. So this stuff has been implemented after past code testing and all that sort of stuff. What I'm going to show you is the step in the middle on how this went from Pattern Labs into this. I'm just going to let this spin out. Okay. Open the local. It may not look exactly like that because it's close. Doesn't have the menu in it, but I can still show the elements. So let's do that. We actually have the Pattern Lab inside of our theme here, and it requires npm and node design. So we have all of this scripted. You guys can see that under the hood whenever I show my own public version of this that doesn't have all of the vision assets and stuff in it. But for now, I'll give you guys an idea. This is what our Pattern Lab for vision looks like. You can see we've got all of our colors defined. Everything is here for the designers. They can either say, yeah, that's great, we like that, and that looks exactly like XD, or that color's off, you need to change it to this hex number. That kind of, when you're in the beginning it starts. Our hero title actually should be italic. It's not. That may have gotten changed revision. But as you go through here, you can see that we have specific H2s and H3s that we've created to be reused in different sections of our site. Specifically the base here, we've got, let's see what web styles. We were using Bootstrap, now we just use Bootstrap Grid. We kind of ended up having to override a lot of the standard Bootstrap styles. They just didn't jive for us, so we stripped out a lot of Bootstrap styling and just left the grid system in place, grids and padding. Go to description. Yeah, it's white. It's white on white. I'm gonna find one of them that's. These are our base components, like it's kind of the boring stuff. You got your lists, your ordered lists, that sort of stuff. When you get into components is where it starts to get kind of fun. You can see how my burger menu is shaping up. So if I show you the burger menu, got the icon here. It's funny because when I'm gonna open this, it's gonna open to the right, but this is just a component, and eventually in the layout, I came up with the rest of the styling. So I was able to use this component in the navigation. Let's see. This looks a little more complete. Looks like something right here, right? So this header organism, we've got ours named a little different just because of some of the nomenclature we wanted to kind of be on the same page with. But this component is comprised of and tells you, this is the handy part about Pattern Labs, the header pattern contains the following patterns. So I can go to the tagline, I can look at the search box, the text button, the vision logo, the burger, horizontal rule. I think it's also used in the home page. So from this organism, I can easily see what it's comprised of. I can also see the twig here without even having to open the code editor. If I'm a designer or I'm a back-end developer, this is useful because I can already see what classes were used. I can see where other components were included. Even though they're listed here, I can see how they were included, what values were given to be passed into that component to make it do what we want. It may have a functionality that we want to replicate here, and so on and so forth. So you can easily see how this can be reused over and over and over again. And the best part of this is that in the Drupal code side of things, this header was referred to directly. So the twig file here would actually be called inside of, let's say the whole header here, everything we see from left to right, this whole thing would be a section, right? And in our case, we built a header section template file. And rather than having to rewrite all of the twig code right directly into Drupal, we used our components module and we told our theme that now it has all these other components that are available to the theme to be used. I can show a little snippet of code of that in just a little bit if anybody is interested. But the gist of it is that we expanded Drupal's theming to be able to use all of this directly without having to replicate code. That's the important part. And then, of course, it shows you the rendered HTML of what that would look like. This whole item here as it's rendered or generated. And you can see here, there's the header, oh, well, those must have been anchor tags. That's funny. I opened a bunch of the same thing. Let's see. Yeah. Let me try opening them one at a time. Yeah. I need to look into that. Might be a little broken. No big deal though. The divider here, we've got different kind of dividers that are used in the site. Trying to remember how we actually the divider that's used is conditional. I can show the code on that. Interested. But basically, we reuse these elements. Unfortunately, my local is not showing the menu bar right now because I either haven't pulled down the main branch or something's up there. I need to probably rebase from origin on that. But it did get pushed into our production server, so you can actually see it in the wild, how it's working. I've done a lot of talking here. Does anybody have questions? Or would anybody want to see my beautiful face?
Love the face. Enjoying the demo. Kind of is the next section you're going to show us a little bit of those include behaviors.
Yeah,
from the Drupal.
Yeah, I can do that.
I'd love to see that.
I meant to do that on not. I meant to do like a kind of kindergarten example of this without showing way too much of our own source code, so to speak.
Sure.
Unfortunately, it's not working. But let me show you what it looks like brand new, broken, and then I'll show you what we've done to incorporate this, and that will give you some contrast of like the range of starting from the beginning and then where we came to now, and that may fill in some of the gaps. So
great, thank you.
Let me. Okay, so here's the pattern lab I generated just for today. Gonna make sure it's still running actually. It seems like it's still working. Okay, and I am going to provide source code for this. There is a GitLab repo that's public, but I've got a few things to fix. But right now, basically, the pattern lab is running, but the integration into Drupal is not running just yet. Go ahead and save this. Might surprise myself. I don't know. Okay, so oops. I'm going to shut the vision. Well, all right. Sorry, I'm a little scatterbrained. Okay. So I've navigated, and I know this is tiny. Let me use that font up a little bit. So I've navigated into our theme, or this theme is the one I tried to create for today, and unfortunately kind of ran out of time. But you can see here that I have my grunt file, my package files, and my pattern lab config file are all already here. Now this is something that's not generated. I actually created this myself. And I will try to provide some documentation as far as I would like to actually have this for other people to use. So I'm going to have to do a little documentation, but the main part is we've got our info file, and this info file is going to look a little bit different than your normal theme info file in the fact that, yep, I figured out why it's not working. I already wrote this once revision and then found a typo there. So basically, our libraries weren't working, but hopefully I can get that going. Anyway, other than that little goof up there, you can see here that your normal stuff from about here up looks like any other Drupal theme. It's when you get to here that you start seeing some differences. And this is specifically the linkage between the Pattern Lab theme and the Drupal theme. And so there's a module called components, just aptly named components. And its entire purpose is to allow you to define paths to other twig components, patterns, whatever you want. And in our case, since we're using Pattern Labs, those just happen to be, here they're named base, components, layouts, templates, and pages. I haven't renamed them, but this would normally be atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and then pages. These three were renamed because of, like I said, we were working on a project and we decided to use these three names colloquially amongst all of us. We changed them, but you can use the one stock right out of the box. You can use atoms, organisms, so on. Not a big deal. But as you can see, it's telling my theme, okay, now you can use all this. So if you go into the components folder here, the components folder here is actually where I installed Pattern Labs inside of the theme. The components folder has its own configuration that Drupal is blind to. Drupal doesn't see any of this stuff. The only thing that Drupal sees or uses is defined in this component library section, and that's going to be your source files. Your source files for Pattern Labs, mainly you're going to focus on the patterns here. And so in this case, which is kind of funny, I haven't renamed this yet. These actually need to be called zero, like I said, 00 atoms, molecules, etc. So they're not going to be able to be used in the theme until I fix this. But you can see all of my atoms here. You can see all of the molecules here, all the organisms. And for instance, like let's look at text. So in text, I have the headings.twig file. Headings.twig file for Pattern Labs is this right here. So this code, if it'll open, not collapsing. I'll take a look at that. I don't know. Anyway, it may be like a JavaScript conflict or something. But this heading, and so on. This headings section. Let's see. It's not running. That's why. See. Let's do npm run start, and then I can show you properly how that works. It was not running. Basically, I've just run the npm command to generate the Pattern Lab. The Pattern Lab in this case is using Browserify, which hosted on localhost port 3000. Through configuration, you can obviously change that. There we go. So you can see that this twig, which is just simple HTML, corresponds to here. It's the same thing. That's literally the same thing. The SAS file, I put in just a little, I just copied, pasted some stuff I found on the internet just to make it look different and add a different style to it. And of course, in Pattern Lab, you can see that this heading is somewhat different from the rest.
So the SAS doesn't show up in Pattern Lab, just the twig and the HTML?
SAS does not show up in here, no. It's actually, so Pattern Lab is agnostic to anything outside of Twig and HTML if you're using a Twig-based Pattern Lab. There's also a handlebars-based Pattern Lab, but I've never done anything with that. I've only used Twig. because of the nature of Drupal. So you do not get, and I'm sure you could probably come up with your own way to do that, which I think actually might be very handy. You bring up a good point, but unfortunately, no, there's no source code here for that specific element. What
That's
I had,
organized.
oh,
Yeah.
what I had to do to keep it organized is on my own. So normally these SAS files aren't picked up by the grunt globber. So I actually had to, where's my grunt file? Can't see this dang. In my grunt file where I do the globbing, I actually had to define where those SAS files come from and glob them together into the respective, basically condense them down into their respective components, base components, layouts, or this could be atoms, organisms, etc. And then, of course, when you do your SAS compile, these partials here are referenced in my styled up SAS file, as you can see here at the end. I wanted them at the end just so that they rendered last, because you can obviously go through and strip out any of this that you feel like you don't need. This is literally bone stock. I installed this yesterday. So, but to get my partials to render last, I put them in order last in the style SAS. So I've had to build a lot of this SAS structure on my own. And that's just because Pattern Labs doesn't care if you use SAS, static CSS, less, whatever you decide to use. It does come with some base stuff. So there is some assumption that you might use SAS inside of it. Like out of the box, it comes with, let's see, this SAS file folder here. It does come with some base stuff. If you use the one, there's a starter kit that's called demo. And then there's like a starter kit that's completely like without any elements at all. You would write all of them and it would assume nothing. You would write all of them yourself. I chose to use the basic twig starter kit so that I would have at least a handful of things on the screen, like these, lists and images. And I may not ever use these, but I just wanted to have something to show today. Like if you wanted to go like straight up, like bone stock, nothing is given, nothing is assumed, you can do that. But on the flip side, you're going to be writing a lot of code. And for me, I went kind of middle of the road and used the base install and then tailored it to use my own partials, include those to where whenever SAS compiles, the globber does all the work first, and then grunt SAS or libsas or whatever takes those pieces, puts them all together, and then spits out a style.css in the end. And as you can see at the end of my style.css are literally those changes. Like it put them in that order because they were last to be compiled. So they're right here at the end of the file. Everything else is before it. So for building a theme as like one person, I did this relatively quick because I've already done it several times. But it might be a little bit ambitious for like a first time project or something like that. If you know your way around like NPM and Node and Composer, and if you're on a Mac, you're using Brew, or if you're Linux, you're using apt or whatever to install these packages. There are a lot of assumptions made that you've got Node running, you've got Composer installed, and that sort of stuff. So fortunately for me, I can do most of it on my Mac, but to try to make it as, I guess, transcendent as possible for other machines, I scripted Lando the best that I could to go ahead and install most of the packages that I would need. This will do everything like the Lando install that I have. It will do everything except serve the Pattern Lab on local host, because you get into like some host file stuff, and you know, you got to like configure it to point to the virtual machine or the container rather than your local machine. But other than that, it does like everything that my Mac does. And this at least gives somebody out of the box. If they pull it down from my repo, they can Lando start and run the Drupal side of things, but they also have enough of the like Node.js and that kind of stuff installed if they want to run globally and run the npm start command and build commands and that sort of stuff. You can also run grunt like manually if you want to. I just happen to have a scripted an npm file, or I mean a grunt file and an npm script to do it all at once. So it like runs Composer, installs all the templates, and then runs npm install and so forth.
Lee?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I have a bit of audio trouble, so glad you can hear me. I have a question, if I can. In terms of the templates, the twig templates that are underneath all this, there's going to be variables in there.
Yes.
Do those variables require a lot of pre-processing to get them sort of the way you want them in a Pattern Lab kind of context? And the reason I want behind that question is another one. If the Pattern Lab designs are being done by a designer who doesn't speak Drupal, they're going to use variables, you know, named according to their own
Right.
thinking, which, you know, sometimes doesn't reconcile with Drupal. How do you do that?
Okay, so one of the things that we've done, and it's just off the bat, we kind of had to learn from each other. I'm not going to say that this was like a fits-all solution, and I can actually show you. Let me open the other project, and I'll show you exactly what we're doing there. Mine was a very basic project, but so for instance, let's say, let's take a look at the nav layout that I created, and it's got several pieces to it. So if we go into header here, go to header twig, right? I'm going to close all my other. Close all. How about that? I'll open this again. Okay, so you can see we've got a few variables in here. I've got a search variable. I've got a tagline variable. Got a newsletter URL, newsletter label, that sort of stuff. And I'm including, like you were mentioning, I'm including other twig elements here, and I want to be able to use these in Drupal. And so what we've had to do is set up a YAML file. The YAML file basically shows what this twig file is expecting in terms of variables. So like you can see here, here's the tagline and the value for it. Static value that you're going to use in the Pattern Lab side, right? And this is just basically to show in the static Pattern Lab, but it also doubles as like, it gives the backend developer some indication of what he or she might have to assign a Drupal variable to this. And so we have a lot of documentation back and forth in our JIRA tickets. And we also have a lot of communications back and forth. We've done pair coding on this. So for the header specifically, I paired myself with Manish Kumar, and Manish and I have a log back and forth in JIRA for this specific ticket. And I try to keep things simple enough as far as variable names that he can just take this and look at it in Twig and be like, oh, okay, that's what that is. Now I got to go find how to create that on the Drupal side. And so on the Drupal side, we can get out of the Pattern Lab, out of the patterns, and into templates where he would actually incorporate this. I don't actually know what block he's got this in. Okay, here we go. So you can see here, there's a lot of conditionals that set those. Tagline basically was one of them, right? He sets in a block, sets tagline to the content field tagline, and then includes the header twig that I wrote here and assigns the variables that need to be passed using the width. And so it says width tagline equal to tagline, interior HR, interior HR. So basically he's done all of his definitions up here and gone out and found what he needs from the Drupal side of things, or maybe a custom field that he set up, or whatever the case may be. He's done conditionals to see, is this the front page? If it is, set logo class and burger class to these SVG classes that we created to fill them with white or fill them with black or dark blue. And so he's done all these conditions here to make sure that he's passing the right variables here. And so when he included my header file, he was able to pass simple variables that it accepts, and then that renders on the home page as the new or the header block. I hope that helps you understand kind of where we're coming from. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. And we do try to keep our naming conventions consistent between the front end developers like myself and the back end developers like Manish.
In terms of that's an interesting point. So in terms of communication, especially across time zones and space, you've got that header YAML file, which is kind of defining, it's like a contract agreement between the front end and back end in a sense. And what I see here is that your strategy is to use twig set to define those variables just before they're included into the actual sub templates and so on. Right?
Yeah, I mean, and you don't necessarily have to do that. Like if he knew, like this is basically to just make it clear for the next developer that picks this up. Like he could literally say, he could literally just use content.field tagline here if he wanted to. But we've done it like this so that I, as a front end developer, this is the first time I've seen this code because I didn't work on this. I worked on my side, but I was able to just go right in there, find this file and explain it easily to you that that's what's going on. So
that's what's going on.
And we do that a lot because I mean, literally we're 12 hours apart. I'm in central, well, 10 and a half now, I think. It's like a half hour. They've got a weird half hour time zone there, but before daylight savings time, we were 11 and a half hours apart. So Manish and I have worked doing this method back and forth, and I bet we've probably spoken verbally to each other on video conference, maybe 5 minutes tops. We generally just don't have a lot of questions for each other. But he's also a very seasoned Acquia developer. And I'm a very seasoned front-end developer, so it kind of works. Now, if you have, sometimes you know, you may have to work with other teammates to kind of like decide what's the best way to pass these variables back and forth. And we've done a lot of that. Like we've done a lot of discovery on this project internally as a team to come up with our best practices for this. And actually, Andre, Angela, and Tony has been a mentor to all of our team. And he has been the one that kind of pushed the naming conventions and standardization. And so we've spent a lot of time doing this, but we also spend quite a bit of time writing documentation just so that everybody's on the same page. And it helps. But at the end of the day, Pattern Labs being directly integrated into the Drupal theme has been like such a time saver, because people were doing Pattern Labs without the components module for the last 5 years or more in Drupal. And basically they would just copy they would have to like write the twig once, then copy it into a template file like this and not include it, but like have to rewrite it using Drupal variables, I guess. And whoever came up with the components module, I guess got tired of doing that. So hats off to them.
Can I just say one more thing? I think
Sure.
you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of process by having really strong emphasis on defining terms and defining language, defining semantics, and so on. I've worked with projects using Pattern Lab where that wasn't done, where there was actually a kind of a tug of war between front and back end, or I should say design and back end, as to who is going to come up with those names and who's going to come up with those variables. And the client, unfortunately, suffered from that. So I think what you've said here is a really key piece of your success.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. I'll pass that along to the rest of the team if they're not already listening right now. But yeah, we spent a lot of time on it, but Andre, he kind of pushed us in the right direction. So we've got a lot to thank him for. He's been on a lot of projects that are large in scope and have several moving parts. And that's helped us quite a bit. So I can't take all the credit. I worked with a really amazing team, and every single one of them are phenomenal. Just great to work with. We're all over the world, but we all care for each other. And another thing that we do is we have a stand up. We have a sync up call. It's kind of like a shift change call, more or less, where we pass the torch every morning. So when our offshore team is settling in for the afternoon or evening, we meet at the end of their day, the beginning of our day, and everyone exchanges comments and questions, and we do a remote sync up call where if we have a problem on a certain task, or we're blocked or whatever the case may be, within like that 30-minute period or maybe an hour sometimes, we work those things out to keep things flowing smoothly, and that's been pretty good for us. So communication is key. I mean, there's no piece of technology that's going to like be a silver bullet and do everything magically without collaboration.
So-
yeah, go ahead.
So it sounds a little bit, so it sounds like everything I'm seeing is fairly artifact oriented. Includes or includes, everything's pretty rigid. Have you done any, I have a project coming up where we're doing a extended theme based on a mother theme that another company is managing. And
Okay.
that's all Pattern Labs based. And I know, like, for instance, in themes, regions don't transmit out when you do theme extensions. Anything, have you done any extensions of this Pattern Lab based
Not-
templature?
Not yet. We probably will. So to give you kind of an example, the vision theme that we're working on right now is for Protivity's vision product, but we plan to use vision Protivity theme as our base theme that we expand upon because after this project is over, we're tasked with redeveloping Protivity.com, and it will be in the same design language. It will be in the same look and feel. And at that point, we will have to consider making some extensions on certain pieces that are already there. We do have a handful of like literal like twig extensions in here, but just haven't had a real big need for it yet since we're creating everything from scratch. This is all brand new. So to answer your question, no, I have not had any elaborate experience with that, but I foresee us going that direction in the fairly near future.
Cool. I'll catch up with you on that in the Slack channels.
Yeah, man, for sure. And how are we on time? We're a little over. Is everybody okay?
Yeah, that was great.
Let me finish up. We've done a lot of talking here, and I hope that I've at least given some of you a splash of flavor on how we want to do this. But I will send out resources, everything, at least everything you've seen here today. And if you need to get a hold of me, my contact information, most of you guys are in Esteemed. You know how to get me there. I don't have any real contact information on the big four. I don't have Twitter or Facebook. So LinkedIn is pretty much my only OG social media platform that I respond to. And you can generally find me just doing a Google search. I also have a barbecue sauce website. So just type in Lee Quessenberry in Google and pretty much everywhere. It comes with having a unique last name. So thanks, everyone. And I look forward to furthering the discussion in the chat if there's no one else that has any questions right now.
Thanks, Lee. That was
Thanks, Lee.
great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again, Lee. We really appreciate having you here. So awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. Great.
And to everybody
presentation.
watching, I'll go ahead and record this, or it's been recording, and I'll go ahead and upload it rather to YouTube, and you'll have that in the Slack channels as well.
Sweet. Thanks, everyone. We'll catch y'all in the Slack.
Awesome. Thank you, Lee.